So today I wanted to talk about a theory from economics as to why buyers and sellers often fail to reach an agreement, even if they privately agree with one another. So let's say we've got a buyer and we've got a seller. This is more about the theory than the art. The seller is selling his house. Let's say it's a villa in Dubai, and the buyer is parting with his money. Now we can obviously think of situations where the buyer and the seller won't come to an agreement. Let's say the buyer values the house at 2.9 million and the seller values the house at 3.1 million. Here a deal is impossible unless they budge, unless they change their private valuations. Sale is impossible. So let's take the other scenario where the buyer values the property at 3.1 and the seller values the property at 2.9. So here we can see that a deal is clearly possible. The buyer values the house at 3.1, so they're willing to pay up to 3.1. The seller values the house at 2.9, so they're willing to accept anything more than 2.9. So there is room for negotiation. The interesting conclusion of the theory is that many deals will fail, even in this scenario. And the reason is because both sides, when negotiating with each other, both sides are incentivized to lie. Honesty is punished, and I'll explain why. So let's say the seller goes first, as is usually the case, and says, I think my property is worth 2.9, therefore I'm going to ask for 2.9. That's my asking price. Immediately, the buyer will say, okay. Now the problem here is that by being honest, the seller has given all of the surplus of the deal to the buyer. That 200K difference now goes to the buyer, with 0 going to the seller. So we know for sure, pretty much, the seller is not going to be honest about their asking price. And we can flip it, and we can see why exactly the case is the same on the other side. If the buyer goes first, which is obviously less common, but it happens. Let's say the buyer says, I value this property at 3.1, therefore I will offer you 3.1. The seller will say, okay, and now they will pocket that full 200K. With the buyer getting 0 trade surplus. So that's why we know the buyer won't be honest. Now, how can we fix this? Well, even if we have an agent in the middle, the problem still remains, because the buyer is not going to be honest with the agent, and the seller is not going to be honest with the agent because they know the agent is acting as a messenger. So the message is the same, basically. An agent can help to bridge the gap and maybe talk sense into one side or the other if one side is being unrealistic, provide them with some data and valuations to try and, reach some sort of consensus. But the problem still remains. The buyer is not going to be honest with the agent or the seller, and the seller is not going to be honest with the agent or the buyer. So, what else can we do? Well, what we have now is we have listings portals. So the seller is not operating in a vacuum. At the end of the day, they can't ask for too much because there's other sellers trying to sell their properties. So let's say we've got this guy is asking for 3 million, let's say. This guy is selling his property and he is asking for 3.1. So these guys are kind of constraining how much he can ask for his property. But the problem with this is even if the location is the same, even if the layout is the same, even if the view is the same, which is usually not the case, these are different properties at the end of the day. They're not all selling the same property. So competition amongst sellers can bridge the gap somewhat and force the seller to be more honest about his valuation, but it isn't a perfect fix. So what can we do instead? Well, if we have multiple buyers competing for the same property, so let's say he is offering 3 million, and he's got his cash, and the next guy is offering 2.9 million. This process of competition amongst the buyers or bidders will force the highest bidder to either be honest about the valuation or as close to honest as possible. And it will do a much better job of bridging that gap than the seller competition, because these guys are all competing for the same property, whereas the sellers are selling different properties. So if we can imagine kind of this gap between the buyer and the seller that exists in private negotiations, a portal will bring it somewhat in, forcing the seller to be a little bit more honest about their valuation. But by allowing the buyers to compete with each other, we're going to force them to close most of that gap. And obviously, how much we can close the gap depends on how much buyer interest we have, how many buyers we have competing with each other. And yeah, this is the conclusion of the theory. The name of the theory is the Myerson-Satterthwaite theorem. And it was published in 1983. And as far as I can tell, the logic still holds. An auction, it's not a perfect solution, but it's a pretty good one. And in terms of property, it's probably as good as we can get. Yeah, that's our little video for today.